the ridge that shouldn't have mattered. September 15th, 1944, 0530 hours. Aboard the USS Mount McKinley, 7 miles off Peleliu Island. Captain James Harrison, intelligence officer with the 3rd Marine Amphibious Corps, studied the pre-invasion reconnaissance photographs one final time before the landing craft launched. The aerial images showed an island roughly 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. Coral ridges running through its center like a spine. Beaches that appeared adequate for landing. His orders indicated the operation would take 4 days, maybe 5. Major General William Rupertus himself had called it a quickie. Harrison set down the photographs and reached for the casualty estimates, prepared weeks earlier by division staff. Expected losses: 800 men to secure the island. He'd seen bloodier predictions. Tarawa had been worse in the projections. Saipan had looked nastier on paper. This would be manageable. 4 days, he said aloud to himself, though no one was near enough to hear. Then on to the Philippines. What Harrison didn't know, what none of them could have known as the first Amtraks churned toward those beaches, was that Peleliu would teach them how completely wrong intelligence could be, how thoroughly assumptions could fail, and how the gap between expectation and reality could be measured not in percentages, but in thousands of lives spent on an island that history would judge as strategically worthless. The mathematics were staggering, though it would take weeks before anyone compiled them fully. The pre-invasion bombardment delivered 5,500 tons of naval shells and hundreds of aerial bombs across those 6 square miles of coral, making it the heaviest concentration of firepower yet delivered in the Pacific War. The naval gunnery officer aboard the USS Pennsylvania recorded firing 5 8-inch salvos at a single coastal gun emplacement, watching the shells impact against the coral fortification. Minutes later, Japanese gunners pushed their weapon back into position and opened fire. The scale of misunderstanding was absolute. The Americans expected 1,100 enemy defenders, perhaps 1,500 at most. Japanese Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded over 11,000 combat troops, plus 2,000 Korean and Okinawan laborers who had spent 6 months digging. Where previous Pacific operations had featured beach defenses and forward positions, Nakagawa had constructed something unprecedented. 500 caves connected by tunnels, with multiple entrances, ventilation shafts, and ammunition storage chambers capable of withstanding direct artillery hits. The coral limestone that formed Peleliu's ridges could absorb 14-inch naval shells without collapsing. The Americans were bringing 20th century industrial firepower against fortifications that operated on principles closer to medieval siege warfare. And they didn't know it yet. Harrison had studied the Japanese defensive patterns across the Pacific since Guadalcanal. 2 years of intelligence work had taught him their methods. Beach defenses aimed at destroying landing craft in the water, banzai charges designed to drive invaders back into the sea, defensive lines that could be flanked and broken. Tarawa had been brutal, but brief. Saipan had been larger, but followed predictable patterns. The template was established. Land under fire, secure the beach, push inland against resistance, enemy falls back, you pursue, operation concludes. 3 to 7 days typically, 10 at the outside. He'd been with Marines since their training at Pavuvu, watching them prepare for exactly that kind of battle. The 1st Marine Division had veterans from Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. They knew jungle fighting, knew beach assaults, knew how to clear an island. When they loaded into the LSTs for the 2,100-mile journey from Pavuvu to Peleliu, they carried 3 days of ammunition, maybe 4 days of rations if they stretched it. No one suggested they'd need more. The intelligence reports Harrison reviewed painted Peleliu as an obstacle to clear, not a strategic necessity. The island held an airfield that could theoretically threaten MacArthur's flank during the upcoming Philippines invasion. Admiral Halsey had actually radioed Nimitz, suggesting they skip Peleliu entirely, concentrate everything on Leyte instead. Nimitz had considered it and ordered the operation forward anyway. The decision seemed reasonable. The island was small. The garrison couldn't be that large. 4 days would be enough. Harrison had believed all of it. Every estimate, every assumption, every comfortable parallel to previous operations. He'd signed off on casualty projections he thought were generous, perhaps even pessimistic. 800 Marines seemed like an appropriately sobering price for a 4-day operation against an island this size. He could not have known that the Japanese had read the same history books, studied the same battles, and concluded that American firepower and maneuver warfare made beach defense suicidal. Lieutenant Colonel Naoyuki Kuzume had demonstrated the new approach at Biak, fighting from caves instead of beaches, making Americans pay for every yard. Peleliu was the first battle where this became official Japanese doctrine across an entire garrison. Let them land, Colonel Nakagawa ordered his men. Save your ammunition. Fire only when you can kill. Dig deeper than they can bomb. Make them come to you in the dark. The Americans steaming toward Peleliu that September morning believed they understood island warfare. They were about to discover they understood nothing. The first indication that something was different came not at the beach, but in the water. Second Lieutenant Robert Blake, age 23 from Jefferson County, Missouri, commanded a platoon with Company K, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. He was crouched in an Amtrak with 37 other Marines, all of them veterans of Cape Gloucester, all of them hot and wet and ready to get off the damned boat and onto the land. The temperature was 115 degrees Fahrenheit with full humidity. And the Amtrak offered no shade, no ventilation, just the smell of diesel fuel and vomit from men who'd been seasick during the crossing. We figured it'd be like the others. Blake said in testimony recorded 2 months later at the Navy Hospital in California, where they'd sent him after his 3rd surgery. Heavy fire on the beach, maybe mortars in the water, but once you got inland, you could find cover. Flank them, call in air support. Standard stuff. We'd done it before. The Amtraks churned through the reef, heading for beaches designated White 1 and White 2. Blake remembered watching the geysers of water rising around the vehicles ahead as they approached the coral reef. Fountains 8-10 feet high, from shells that seemed to be landing with mathematical precision. Then the machine gun fire started. Not random bursts, but concentrated volleys that punched through the thin armor of the Amtraks with methodical regularity. We lost 3 vehicles before we hit the beach, Blake testified. Just gone. 1 minute they were there, next minute they were sinking. The guys in the water, the ones who weren't hit, they tried to swim. Machine gun fire got most of them. I remember thinking, this is more than there's supposed to be. We were told light resistance on the beach. This wasn't light. When Blake's Amtrak made it to shore, the ramp dropped, and he saw what he later described as a continuous sheet of flame backed by a thick wall of smoke. The beach was already littered with destroyed vehicles, dead Marines, wounded men trying to crawl to cover that didn't exist. The sand itself seemed to be exploding, shells landing every few seconds, machine gun fire coming from positions they couldn't see. We ran inland, Blake said. Standard tactics. Get off the beach. Find cover in the vegetation. Except there wasn't vegetation anymore. The bombardment had stripped everything down to bare coral. No cover. No concealment. Just flat ground with Japanese firing from somewhere we couldn't identify. That's when I started thinking this wasn't going to be quick. By the end of the first day, The 1st Marine Regiment had taken 590 casualties out of roughly 3,000 men. Not light resistance, not a quick operation. Something else entirely. Harrison came ashore on the 2nd day, when the beachhead was supposedly secure enough for headquarters staff. He'd expected to set up shop near the airfield, start processing prisoner interrogations, begin filing reports about enemy strength and disposition. Instead, he found himself lying flat in a shell crater, while mortar rounds searched the beach with the patience of someone who had all the ammunition in the world, and no reason to. Hurry. The first thing he noticed was the heat. Not just the temperature, though that remained at 115 degrees, but heat radiating from the coral itself, baked by the sun and by the thousands of explosions that had turned the surface into something like a griddle. Men were collapsing from heat stroke faster than they were being hit by enemy fire. Water discipline broke down within hours. Canteens that were supposed to last a full day were empty by noon. The second thing he noticed was the silence between attacks. For 10, 15 minutes at a time, everything would go quiet. The Japanese guns would stop. No mortars, no rifle fire, nothing. You could almost believe the enemy had pulled back, had retreated to whatever defensive line they were supposed to be holding, according to the doctrine Harrison had studied. Then a Marine would stand up, or a group would gather to receive orders, and within seconds the mortars would start again, firing perhaps 3 or 4 rounds, just enough to kill or wound whoever had exposed themselves. And then silence would return. "They're watching us," said a Marine gunnery sergeant who'd survived Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. The man was 31 years old, ancient by Marine standards, and Harrison found himself trusting his judgment. "They're not just dug in. They're hunting us, waiting for targets. I've never seen fire discipline like this." Harrison spent that night in a crater, listening to the sounds of infiltrators testing the American perimeter. Quiet noises, the scratch of someone moving slowly across coral, occasional bursts of close-range firing, screams that ended quickly. In the morning, they found 17 dead Marines who'd been killed in their foxholes by Japanese soldiers who'd crept through the lines in darkness, cutting throats or shooting men at point-blank range before disappearing back into the coral ridges. "The assault phase will be complete in 4 days," he told his staff before the landing. On the morning of day 3, with the Marines barely 500 yards inland and taking casualties that far exceeded projections, Harrison began to understand that every assumption they'd made was wrong. The pattern emerged systematically over the following week, as Marines tried to push into the ridges that dominated Peleliu's center. Corporal Eugene Sledge, aged 21, from Mobile, Alabama, had joined the 5th Marine Regiment as a replacement after their losses at Cape Gloucester. He was carrying a mortar, 60 pounds of weapon and ammunition, through terrain that grew stranger with every yard. The coral ridges were unlike anything he'd encountered in training or read about in after-action reports. Sharp as glass in some places, pocked with holes and caves in others, stripped of vegetation by the bombardment so that there was no shade, no soft ground, no place where a man could rest without cutting himself on the stone. "We thought we understood caves," Sledge testified in interviews recorded decades later. "You assault the entrance, throw in grenades or satchel charges, maybe use flamethrowers. Cave collapses or the enemy inside is killed. We'd done it before, worked fine. But on Peleliu, the caves weren't simple. They went deep into the coral, with bends and turns that deflected blast. We'd throw in grenades and hear them explode, go in thinking we'd cleared it, find Japanese still alive deeper inside. Or we'd clear a cave, and an hour later Japanese would be firing from it again because there was another entrance somewhere we hadn't found." The Marines began encountering a defensive system unlike anything in their experience or doctrine. Where previous Pacific battlefields had featured prepared positions along predictable defensive lines, Peleliu's defense had no lines. Every ridge was a fortress. Every cave was connected to 10 others. The Japanese could fire from one position, disappear through a tunnel, emerge elsewhere, fire again. Artillery spotters hidden in elevated caves could call down mortar fire on any American position with terrifying accuracy. Machine gun nests appeared to cover every approach. But destroying one position didn't silence the others, because they were all independently supplied through underground passages. Captain Everett Pope, age 26 from Massachusetts, led Company C of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, in an assault on a ridge the Marines were calling Hill 100. The designation was optimistic, implying there might not be a Hill 200 or 300 to worry about afterward. Pope's company numbered 89 men when they started up the slope. The ridge was roughly 60 yards across and 150 yards long, covered in broken coral and featuring 3 distinct peaks connected by saddles. We advanced in standard formation. Pope testified after being awarded the Medal of Honor for the action. Fire and movement, using whatever cover we could find. But there wasn't cover. Not really. The bombardment had broken up the coral into fragments, which the Japanese mortar fire turned into shrapnel. Every time a shell landed, you got the explosion plus hundreds of pieces of coral flying in every direction. It multiplied the effectiveness of their artillery by a factor I couldn't calculate. Men were being wounded by rocks as much as by steel. Pope's company took the hill after 6 hours of fighting. They counted 42 men still able to fight when they reached the summit. That night, the Japanese counterattacked 9 separate times, infiltrating through caves and tunnels that the Marines hadn't known existed. Each time, Pope's men fought them off in close combat, sometimes hand-to-hand, when ammunition ran low. By morning, Pope had 12 men left unwounded. They'd held the hill but lost 77% of the company doing it. That's when I understood we weren't fighting a battle, Pope said. We were fighting terrain that bled us every time we moved. And we hadn't even reached the worst of it yet. Harrison began collecting the casualty reports on day 7, when Division Headquarters established a proper command post inland. The numbers were worse than anything in the projections. The 1st Marine Regiment had landed with approximately 3,000 men. After 1 week, they'd taken 1,449 casualties, 48%. The 5th Marines reported 938 casualties out of roughly 3,000 men. The 7th Marines, which had landed later, already reported 512 casualties. Total division casualties, 2,899 men in 7 days. Harrison did the mathematics. At this rate, the entire 1st Marine Division would be destroyed in approximately 14 days. The operation wasn't supposed to last that long. It was supposed to be over already. He began interviewing survivors, trying to understand what was happening. Every conversation revealed the same pattern. Japanese firing from positions the Marines couldn't identify, caves that couldn't be cleared, counterattacks that emerged from nowhere, defensive positions that took hours to capture and cost dozens of lives to secure. Lieutenant Harold Davidson, age 24 from Oregon, commanded a rifle platoon with the 7th Marines. He'd fought on Guadalcanal and thought he understood jungle warfare, understood fighting in difficult terrain. Peleliu was teaching him otherwise. The Japanese learned? Davidson told Harrison during an interview on day 9. That's what we're fighting. They learned from every battle we won. Tarawa taught them that beach defenses don't work against our naval gunfire. Saipan taught them that banzai charges just get their men killed. So here they've created something new. They don't try to stop us at the beach. They let us land. They don't waste men on charges. They make us come to them in the caves where our advantages don't matter. Artillery and naval gunfire can't reach them. Air support can't see them. We have to go in with rifles and grenades, and it costs us men every single time. Davidson paused, looked at the ridges visible from the command post, the terrain that dominated the center of Peleliu like a malignant tumor. Sir, with respect, someone should have known this. Someone should have scouted the caves. Someone should have told us we'd need flamethrowers and satchel charges for every single position. We came here thinking it was a beach assault and an easy mop-up. It's not. It's siege warfare against fortifications we can't destroy. And I don't know if we have enough men to finish it. Harrison filed his first revised casualty estimate that evening. 3,000 casualties minimum to secure Peleliu. Possibly more if the Japanese continued their current defensive pattern. 4 times his original projection. He noted in his report that the island's strategic value might not justify the cost. The message went up the chain of command. No response came back. The Americans called it Bloody Nose Ridge, though its proper name was Umur Brogal Mountain. The designation captured both the terrain's nature and what it cost to fight there. Private First Class Russell Davis, age 19, from Alabama, was in a rifle squad with Company K, 5th Marines, when they received orders to assault the ridge on day 12. His squad had started the battle with 13 men. 7 remained. You couldn't see the Japanese. Davis testified in interviews recorded after the war. That's what made it terrible. You'd be advancing up the coral, watching every step because the rock could tear your legs open if you fell. And suddenly someone next to you would drop, shot from somewhere. You'd look around, see nothing but bare rock and cave entrances. Couldn't identify which cave the shot came from because the sound echoed off all the ridges. So you'd keep moving, and someone else would get hit. Eventually, you'd get close enough to a cave to throw in a grenade or use a flamethrower. Clear it out. Think you'd solve the problem. Then you'd get shot from a different cave you hadn't known was there. Or from the same cave you thought you'd cleared because there was a secondary tunnel connecting it to a deeper position. The fighting on Bloody Nose Ridge followed a pattern that repeated dozens of times across September and October. Marines would assault a position, take casualties advancing, take more casualties securing it, then take even more casualties holding it against infiltrators and counterattacks. The ridge was roughly 600 yards long and 400 yards wide, covered in peaks and saddles, honeycombed with caves. Every yard cost men. The temperature remained above 100 degrees every day. Water resupply became a crisis. Men fighting on the ridges went through canteens in hours, not days. The division instituted water discipline that rationed every Marine to 2 canteens per day, total for drinking, washing, and cooling. It wasn't enough. Heat casualties mounted alongside combat casualties. Medical evacuation from the ridges was particularly deadly. Japanese spotters watched for stretcher bearers, knowing that shooting a wounded man required the Americans to assign 2 more men to carry him out. Captain Stanley Holmes, a battalion surgeon with the 1st Marines, noted in his diary that stretcher bearers were taking 50% casualties in some sectors. They shoot the bearers first, then the wounded man, then any reinforcements who come to help. Holmes wrote on day 18. It's calculated. They've determined that wounding is more valuable than killing because it drains our manpower faster. On day 21, the Marines made their first assault on a formation they were calling the 5 Sisters, 5 coral peaks arranged in a rough semicircle, all of them fortified, all of them mutually supporting. Captain Andrew Haldane, age 26, from Massachusetts, commanded Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines in the attack. The assault began at 0600 hours with a 45-minute artillery barrage that accomplished, by Haldane's estimate, precisely nothing of value. The shells exploded against coral that absorbed the blast, while Japanese defenders waited deep in caves where the bombardment couldn't reach them. When the barrage lifted and the Marines advanced, Japanese positions came alive with machine gun fire that swept every approach. "We tried flanking maneuvers," Haldane reported. "Couldn't flank them. The ridges were too steep, the corral too broken. We tried frontal assault. That just got men killed on the approaches. We tried infiltration at night. The Japanese infiltrated us back and killed men in their foxholes. Nothing we'd been trained to do worked. Eventually, we had to accept that the only way to take a position was to assault it directly, use flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear the caves, then hold it against counterattacks. Every position, every single cave. There was no cleverness that worked, just grinding attrition." Company K took the first peek of the Five Sisters on day 23. They'd started the battle with 235 men. 87 remained unwounded. To take 5 peaks, Haldane calculated, would require more men than he had. He requested reinforcements. Division headquarters sent a platoon, 40 men. It wasn't enough. Over the next 11 days, the Marines fought for each peak of the Five Sisters, taking casualties that matched anything Tarawa or Saipan had produced. Japanese sniper fire was so accurate that Marines learned not to expose themselves for even seconds. Officers stopped wearing rank insignia because snipers targeted them specifically. Radio operators were killed methodically because the Japanese knew killing them disrupted communications. Flamethrower operators lasted, on average, less than 1 day because the Japanese understood how dangerous they were and focused fire on them. Sergeant Alvin Josephy, age 27, from New York, a forward observer with an artillery battery, kept detailed notes about Japanese fire discipline. "They don't shoot randomly," he recorded on day 29. "They wait. You could stand in the open for 5 minutes sometimes, and nothing would happen. Then someone would move their head above cover, or 2 men would gather to talk, and instantly mortars or rifle fire. Exactly calibrated. Just enough rounds to kill the targets, then silence again. They're conserving ammunition and maximizing our casualties simultaneously. It's brilliant and terrible." Harrison had stopped filing casualty estimates. The numbers were beyond prediction now. The 1st Marine Regiment had been destroyed as a fighting unit, relieved on day 10 with 56% casualties. The 5th Marines were taking casualties faster than replacements arrived. The 7th Marines reported that rifle companies, which started the battle with 200 men, were down to 60 or 70 effectives. On day 28, September 28th to be specific, he interviewed Colonel Lewis Puller, legendary Marine commander who'd been fighting since Haiti in the 1920s, who'd earned 4 Navy Crosses in previous campaigns. Puller looked exhausted in a way Harrison hadn't seen in any previous operation. "We're not winning this with tactics," Puller said. "We're winning by having more men than they have bullets. That's the only advantage we have. They shoot, we die. We send more men. Eventually they run out of ammunition, or we reach their positions and clear them with flamethrowers. It's not warfare. It's arithmetic. And the arithmetic says we'll lose 6,000 Marines before this is finished." 6,000. Harrison's original estimate had been 800. The actual number would ultimately reach 10,000 when the Army units were counted, though Harrison didn't know that yet. What he did know, sitting in the command post on day 28, was that every assumption they'd brought to Peleliu had failed. The operation was supposed to take 4 days. They were approaching 1 month with no end visible. The Japanese were supposed to number 1,100 to 1,500 men. Intelligence now estimated over 11,000, and that estimate was looking conservative. The caves were supposed to be simple defensive positions. They were actually a three-dimensional fortress system that negated American advantages in firepower and mobility. The island was supposed to be strategically necessary. Admiral Halsey had argued from the beginning it could be bypassed. Every day the battle continued made Halsey look more correct. Harrison began working on a report that would attempt to explain how the intelligence had been so comprehensively wrong. He never finished it. On day 31, a mortar round landed near the command post, sending coral fragments through the tent where Harrison was working. One fragment caught him in the abdomen, another in the leg. They evacuated him to a hospital ship, where he spent 6 weeks recovering before being sent to Pearl Harbor for reassignment. The psychological transformation happened gradually for most men, suddenly for others, but universally across the division by the end of October. Private First Class Robert Oswalt, age 20 from Texas, marked the moment of his understanding on day 35, October 20th to be precise. His platoon had been fighting on Bloody Nose Ridge for 2 weeks straight, rotating back to reserve positions for 1 day out of every 4, then returning to the ridges. They'd cleared the same set of caves 3 times because Japanese defenders kept reoccupying them through tunnels the Marines couldn't find or block. We were sitting in a crater, 8 of us, waiting for orders to assault another position. Oswalt testified in 1946. Someone, I don't remember who, said out loud, "Why are we doing this?" And nobody had an answer. We knew the mission. Take the island. But why? Why this island? Why these ridges? We'd already taken the airfield on day 3 or 4. We had Ulithi for fleet anchorage. MacArthur was about to land in the Philippines regardless of what happened here. So, what were we dying for? The question spread through the division like disease. Officers tried to maintain morale by talking about strategic necessity, about protecting MacArthur's flank, about denying the Japanese a base. But men who'd been fighting for 5 weeks, who'd watched friends die in numbers that exceeded anything they'd experienced, couldn't help calculating the exchange rate. 10,000 American casualties to eliminate 11,000 Japanese defenders on an island that multiple senior commanders had argued was unnecessary. The mathematics didn't favor the decision to attack. Corporal Sterling Mace, aged 19 from New York, experienced his moment of clarity on day 41. His squad was consolidating a position they'd taken on the ridge when a Marine from another company arrived with fresh water. The man was clean, relatively speaking, hadn't been in combat for several days, and was stunned by what he saw on the ridges. He looked at us like we were ghosts, Mace recalled in interviews decades later. We must have looked terrible. We'd been wearing the same uniforms for 6 weeks, torn up from the coral, stained with dirt and blood, stinking because there was no water for washing. We were all thin, dehydrated, exhausted. And this guy says, "I heard the assault phase was declared over on day 12. What are you still doing here?" Nobody answered him. What could we say? We were still here because the Japanese were still here and we'd been ordered to kill them all. The fact that division headquarters had declared the assault phase complete while we were still dying on the ridges, that was its own kind of truth. The declaration on day 27, October 12th, that the assault phase of Peleliu was complete, had been met with bitter mockery by men still fighting. Division headquarters meant that the island was secure enough for construction battalions to begin work on the airfield. But secure was relative. Japanese mortar fire still fell on the airfield regularly. Snipers still operated throughout the island. The ridges still held thousands of Japanese defenders who showed no intention of surrendering. We'd been told this would be easy, Mace said. 4 days, a quickie. That's what the general promised. And here we were 6 weeks in, still dying, still clearing the same caves over and over. and someone at headquarters had decided to call it finished, even though we all knew it wasn't. That's when I understood we'd been lied to. Not intentionally, maybe, but lied to. They'd told us something they believed was true, and it was completely false, and hundreds of men had died because of it. The contrast between expectation and reality crystallized in specific moments for survivors. Private First Class Eugene Sledge kept a small Bible in his pack throughout the campaign. On its margins, he recorded names of men killed, dates of particular actions, small observations about the fighting. On day 48, he wrote, "We came here thinking we'd fight Japanese soldiers. We fought Coral. The Coral killed as many men as the enemy did. Heat, exhaustion, dehydration, men falling on the rocks and breaking bones. Coral fragments from mortar blasts, tearing through flesh. We trained for 2 years to fight an enemy, and the terrain itself defeated us." The disparity between resources expended and value gained haunted thinking men throughout the operation. The Navy delivered over 5,500 tons of shells onto Peleliu before the landing, then provided fire support throughout the campaign. The Air Force flew hundreds of sorties. Artillery battalions fired tens of thousands of rounds. The Marines expended ammunition at rates that required constant resupply runs under Japanese fire. All of this for an island 6 miles long and 2 miles wide that Admiral Halsey had argued could simply be ignored. Staff Sergeant Thomas Hanlon, age 25, from Pennsylvania, an intelligence specialist who'd been assigned to assess captured documents, began reading Japanese diaries recovered from dead soldiers. The translation work gave him insight into the enemy's perspective that few other Marines had. They knew they were going to die, Hanlon told Harrison's replacement in November. That was clear from the diaries. Colonel Nakagawa told them from the beginning this was a defense to the death. No surrender, no retreat, just kill as many Americans as possible before dying. And they were calculating about it. One diary from a machine gunner noted that he'd averaged 3 Americans killed per day for 38 days before we overran his position. He was proud of the efficiency. Another diary talked about ammunition discipline, about how they'd been ordered to fire only when they could guarantee kills. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to make us pay the maximum price. And it worked. The human cost became visible in ways beyond casualty figures. The 1st Marine Division's mental health evacuations exceeded anything from previous campaigns. Men who'd fought on Guadalcanal without psychiatric problems broke down on Peleliu. The heat, the grinding attrition, the sense that the battle served no strategic purpose, all of it accumulated into psychological damage that persisted after physical wounds healed. Navy psychiatrist Lieutenant Commander Samuel Thompson treated over 300 psychiatric casualties from Peleliu during October and November. The men understand sacrifice when it serves a purpose, Thompson wrote in his report. Guadalcanal was terrible, but necessary. Saipan was brutal, but opened. The path to the Philippines. Peleliu felt unnecessary, even while they were fighting it. That knowledge that they might be dying for nothing, that damaged men in ways physical wounds don't. I had Marines who'd survived 3 previous campaigns come to me unable to function because they couldn't reconcile the casualties with the objective. The arrival of the Army's 81st Infantry Division on Day 30, October 15th, provided relief to the exhausted Marines, but didn't change the fundamental nature of the battle. Colonel Robert Dark, age 38 from Georgia, commanded the 321st Infantry Regiment that took over operations on Bloody Nose Ridge. His men were fresh, trained, eager to prove themselves. Within 3 days, they understood what the Marines had learned in 5 weeks. "The Japanese fight with precision I've never encountered," Dark reported on Day 33. Every position is fortified. Every cave connects to others. They've calculated the exact range to every approach and pre-registered their mortars. They don't waste ammunition. They don't expose themselves unnecessarily. They simply wait for us to come to them, and they kill us efficiently. My regiment has taken 542 casualties in 3 days. We've advanced perhaps 100 yards. At this rate, clearing the remaining Japanese positions will take weeks and cost thousands more men. Dark's prediction proved accurate. The 81st Division fought on Peleliu until late November, taking 3,278 casualties before the island was finally declared secure. The Japanese garrison, which had numbered approximately 11,000 men, was effectively annihilated. Only 302 prisoners were taken, and of those, only 19 were Japanese combat soldiers. The rest were Korean laborers. The final tally: 10,995 American casualties, including 2,336 killed. The 1st Marine Division alone suffered 6,526 casualties, with 1,252 killed. The division was effectively destroyed as a combat unit and didn't return to action until Okinawa, 6 months later. Major General Roy Geiger, who commanded the operation, testified after the war that Peleliu was the toughest battle of the Pacific War. Most veterans agreed. Some who'd fought in World War I's trenches said Peleliu was worse. The combination of heat, terrain, enemy tactics, and duration created conditions that exceeded anything in their experience. And for what? The question haunted evaluations of the campaign for decades afterward. The strategic assessment came gradually, assembled from testimony and analysis over the year following Peleliu's capture. The official justification for the operation had been threefold: secure the airfield to prevent attacks on MacArthur's flank, deny the Japanese a base for counterattacks, and provide support for the upcoming Philippines campaign. Each justification crumbled under examination. The airfield. American forces captured it on Day 3, September 18th. But by that date, MacArthur had already landed on Morotai and was preparing for Leyte. The Peleliu airfield contributed nothing to either operation. Planes based there flew some support missions, but nothing that couldn't have been accomplished from other bases. The Japanese base. Intelligence reports after the battle confirmed that Japanese forces on Peleliu had no offensive capability. They had no aircraft, no ships, minimal ammunition for anything beyond defensive operations. They posed no threat to American operations in the Philippines. They could, as Admiral Halsey had argued, have been simply bypassed and left to wither on the vine. Support for Philippines operations. The Philippines invasion began on October 20th, Day 35 of the Peleliu campaign. American forces were still fighting on Bloody Nose Ridge when MacArthur landed at Leyte. Peleliu contributed nothing to that landing success. Post-war historians were less diplomatic than official reports. William Manchester, Marine veteran and historian, wrote, "The Japanese on this island could have been left to wither on the vine without altering the course of the Pacific War in any way. The decision to take Peleliu was a mistake, and the men who died there died for nothing." Even more damning was the revelation that the operation had been questioned before it began. Admiral Halsey had explicitly radioed Admiral Nimitz, suggesting Peleliu be bypassed. Nimitz acknowledged the suggestion had merit, but ordered the operation forward anyway. The reasons for that decision remained unclear. Momentum, perhaps. Reluctance to waste the planning already completed. Unwillingness to appear to back down from a committed operation. Whatever the reason, the result was 10,000 American casualties for an objective that history judged as strategically worthless. The psychological cost extended beyond the campaign itself, manifesting in how survivors processed their experience. Eugene Sledge, who survived Peleliu and later Okinawa, spent decades trying to understand what he'd experienced. His memoir, published in 1981, captured the moral weight of unnecessary sacrifice. To be shelled by massed artillery and mortars is absolutely terrifying. But to be shelled in the open at that airfield is terror compounded beyond the belief of anyone who hasn't experienced it. The feeling of total helplessness is so overwhelming that you realize the only thing keeping you alive is random chance. And when you survive that, and later learn the battle served little purpose, it does something to your soul. The question of purpose haunted other survivors as well. Sterling Mace wrote decades later, "We were told it would be 4 days. It took 74. We were told casualties would be light. We lost 1/3 of the division. We were told the island was strategically necessary. Historians say it wasn't. At some point you have to ask, what were we doing there? And I've never found a good answer." The contrast between official proclamations and veteran experience created a divide that persisted. Division headquarters declared the assault phase complete on day 27, when fighting continued for another 5 weeks. Official casualty estimates bore no relationship to actual losses. Strategic justifications dissolved under post-war analysis. For men who'd fought and watched friends die, these discrepancies weren't bureaucratic failures. They were existential betrayals. Captain Everett Pope, who received the Medal of Honor for his leadership on Hill 100, was asked in 1975 whether he felt his sacrifice had been worth it. His answer was carefully measured. "I did what I was ordered to do. My men fought bravely. Whether the operation itself was necessary, I'm not qualified to judge. But I will say that if you're going to order men to fight and die, you should be certain the objective justifies the cost. I'm not certain that was true at Peleliu." The broader context of the Pacific War makes Peleliu's tragedy more comprehensible, if not more justifiable. In September 1944, American forces were advancing on multiple fronts. MacArthur's command was preparing to return to the Philippines, fulfilling his promise to the Filipino people and establishing bases for the invasion of Japan. Nimitz's command was advancing through the Central Pacific, taking islands that would serve as bomber bases and fleet anchorages. The two commands operated semi-independently, occasionally coordinated, but often competitive. Peleliu fell into this complex command structure awkwardly. It was a Central Pacific operation under Nimitz, but its supposed purpose was supporting MacArthur's Southwest Pacific advance. The coordination between commands was imperfect. When MacArthur's timeline accelerated and he decided to bypass several intermediate objectives and go straight to Leyte, the strategic justification for Peleliu weakened. But the operation was already committed. Ships were already loaded. Men were already briefed. Canceling would have required inter-service coordination that didn't exist in time. The result was that 10,000 men paid for organizational and strategic inflexibility. Comparing Peleliu to successful operations highlights the cost of miscalculation. Tarawa, fought 11 months earlier, cost 1,515 American lives, but provided a crucial atoll for subsequent operations. Saipan, fought 3 months before Peleliu, cost 3,225 American lives, but opened the path for BI-29 bombing raids on Japan. Both operations were terrible in their casualty rates, but undeniably necessary. Peleliu cost over 2,300 lives and accomplished by most historical assessments. Nothing that couldn't have been accomplished through bypass. The Americans took the island because they'd planned to take it. Because canceling seemed more complicated than proceeding, because intelligence had suggested it would be easy. None of these are reasons that justify the cost in retrospect. The deeper truth about Peleliu emerged not in any single revelation, but in the accumulation of evidence over decades. The tactical lessons were valuable, even as the strategic decision remained questionable. The Japanese defensive system at Peleliu, fighting from interconnected caves with strict fire discipline, became the template for Japanese defense throughout the rest of the war. Iwo Jima and Okinawa both featured similar tactics, scaled up to larger islands. American forces learned at Peleliu how to fight this kind of battle. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, systematic cave clearing, infantry tank coordination. The lessons cost lives, but saved lives in subsequent operations. The strategic lesson was more bitter. Not every operation that can be launched should be launched. Just because planning is complete doesn't mean circumstances haven't changed. Intelligence that proves incorrect should trigger operational reassessment, not continuation of flawed plans. The cost of admitting error is lower than the cost of 10,000 casualties. The human lesson was perhaps most important. Men will fight with extraordinary courage for objectives they believe are necessary. But asking them to die for questionable purposes damages not just individuals, but institutions. The 1st Marine Division suffered psychiatric casualties at Peleliu at rates never before recorded. Post-war analysis suggested the combination of brutality and perceived futility created psychological damage that exceeded physical wounds. Men could accept death for cause, but struggled to accept death for error. Today, 79 years after the battle, Peleliu remains a backwater of the Pacific War's history. Most Americans who know about Iwo Jima or Okinawa have never heard of Peleliu. The lack of media coverage during the battle, the strategic questions about its necessity, and the subsequent focus on larger operations all contributed to Peleliu's obscurity. But for those who fought there, Peleliu was never obscure. It was the defining experience of their lives, the battle that showed them how completely wrong assumptions could be, how thoroughly expectations could fail, how deeply the gap between prediction and reality could run. The Pacific War Memorial on Peleliu stands on a hillside overlooking the airfield, the same airfield that Marines captured on Day 3 and for which thousands more died in the weeks afterward. The memorial lists the names of Americans who died there, carved in stone that will outlast memory. Visitors occasionally come, mostly descendants of veterans, seeking to understand what their fathers and grandfathers experienced. A guide who works at the memorial, an elderly Palawan man whose father witnessed the battle as a civilian laborer, tells visitors about the bombardment, about the fighting in the ridges, about the heat and the brutality. When visitors ask whether the battle was necessary, he gives the same answer every time. The Americans came to fight the Japanese. The Japanese stayed to kill Americans. Neither side could leave, so they fought until one side was destroyed. Whether it was necessary is a question for historians. For the men who fought here, it was simply what happened. That perhaps is the final lesson of Peleliu. Wars contain battles that in retrospect seem unnecessary, operations that might have been bypassed, objectives that didn't justify their cost. But for the men ordered to fight them, such questions are luxuries of peacetime analysis. They fought because they were ordered to fight. They died because wars kill people regardless of strategic necessity. They suffered because suffering is what combat inflicts on everyone involved. The real tragedy of Peleliu is not that Americans won at high cost. It's that the high cost purchased little of value. The ridge that cost 6,000 Marines their casualties was called Bloody Nose for good reason. But it shouldn't have mattered at all. that it mattered only because men were ordered to take it, not because taking it served any essential purpose, is what makes Peleliu one of the Pacific War's most painful memories. The 800 casualties Captain Harrison predicted in September became 10,000 by December. The 4-day operation became 74 days. The easy victory became one of the war's most brutal battles, and the strategic necessity became, in historical judgment, a strategic error. What Harrison didn't know, studying those reconnaissance photographs on September 15th, was that every assumption that informed his estimates was wrong, that the Japanese had created something unprecedented, that the cost would exceed projections by an order of magnitude, and that decades later historians would argue the entire operation had been avoidable. He learned all of this over the weeks that followed, revelation by revelation, as expectation collided with reality and shattered into fragments as sharp as Peleliu's coral. The learning cost, 10,000 American casualties and 11,000 Japanese lives. Whether the lesson was worth the price remains, 8 decades later, an open question.